The blood-red sun dipped below the distant mountains as Abigail Sinclair stared at the charred remains of her father's ranch, tears streaking through the soot on her face. The year was 1875, and everything she had ever dreamed of was now nothing but ashes and bitter smoke rising into the Wyoming sky. Abigail had returned from Cheyenne to find their family ranch destroyed, her father's body buried hastily by neighbors, and a crude note pinned to what remained of the barn door. Payment collected, Dawson. The cattle baron who had threatened her father for months had finally made good on his promise to take what he believed was his. At 22, Abigail had been raised with the promise that the Double S Ranch would someday be hers. She had learned to ride, rope, and shoot alongside the ranch hands, much to the dismay of the town's more proper citizens. Her father, Samuel Sinclair, had never remarried after her mother's death during childbirth, instead pouring his heart into raising his daughter and building their modest but thriving cattle operation. Now she stood alone, her simple blue traveling dress fluttering in the evening breeze, her honey-colored hair tumbling from its pins. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her reach for the small derringer hidden in her pocket, her father's last gift to her before she'd left for what was supposed to be a short visit to her aunt in Cheyenne. "Whoa there!" a deep voice called out, and a tall figure on horseback emerged from the gathering dusk. The man pulled his mount to a stop, taking in the scene with a grim expression. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but Abigail could see the hard lines of his sun-weathered face and the piercing blue of his eyes. "If you're one of Dawson's men, you best ride on," Abigail said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the trembling of her hand around the small pistol. The stranger dismounted, his movements fluid and controlled. He was dressed in typical cowboy attire, worn denim, leather chaps, and a faded blue shirt beneath a dust-covered leather vest. The silver star pinned to his chest caught the last rays of sunlight. "Marshal Matthew Yates," he introduced himself, removing his hat to reveal dark hair with a slight wave to it. "Rode out when I heard what happened to Samuel Sinclair." He paused, studying her face. "You must be his daughter." "Abigail," she confirmed, relaxing her grip on the derringer but not releasing it entirely. "Though it appears you're too late, Marshal." Matthew nodded, replacing his hat and taking a few steps toward the ruins. "I'm sorry about your father, Miss Sinclair. Samuel was a good man." He turned back to face her. "The neighbor who sent for me, Mrs. Turner, said you were away when it happened." "In Cheyenne," Abigail said bitterly. "Father insisted I visit my aunt, said there was trouble brewing, but wouldn't tell me what." She gestured toward the destruction. "Now I understand why." The marshal's face hardened. "Victor Dawson has been buying up or burning down every small ranch between here and the mountains. Your father was one of the few who stood against him." Abigail felt a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill, but fought them back. "And died for it." "Mrs. Turner said you could stay with them tonight," Matthew offered. "Tomorrow we can—" "No," Abigail interrupted, squaring her shoulders. "This is my land, all that's left of my father's legacy. I won't be driven from it." Matthew looked around at the destroyed buildings. "There's nothing left standing but half a barn wall, Miss Sinclair." "Then I'll sleep against that wall, Marshal Yates." She set her jaw stubbornly. The last light was fading quickly, and Matthew shook his head. "That's not wise, madam. Dawson's men might return, or wolves, or any number of dangers." "I have my father's gun," she said, finally bringing out the small derringer. Matthew almost smiled. "That pea-shooter won't stop a determined coyote, let alone a man intent on harm." As if to punctuate his words, a distant howl echoed across the plains. Abigail involuntarily shivered, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. "Look," Matthew said more gently, "I have supplies on my horse. If you're determined to stay, at least allow me to help you set up a proper camp and keep watch through the night." Abigail hesitated. This man was a lawman, not one of Dawson's thugs, but she had learned early that, in the West, a woman alone had to be cautious of any man's intentions. Yet something in his steady gaze reassured her. "Very well, Marshal. I accept your help for tonight." Matthew nodded and returned to his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa with intelligent eyes. He removed his bedroll, a small cooking pot, and a canvas bag of provisions. Working efficiently, he gathered wood from the ruins and soon had a small fire burning. Abigail watched him work, noticing the way he moved with quiet confidence. He wasn't a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he was now. His hands were calloused but gentle as he arranged the simple camp. "Have you been Marshal long?" she asked, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. 5 years in Willow Creek, he answered, settling on his bedroll across the fire from her. "Before that, I rode with a Texas outfit, then scouted for the Army during the war. And now you chase cattle thieves and murderers like Dawson," she said bitterly. Matthew's expression darkened. "Dawson is careful. He has men do his dirty work, and witnesses have a way of disappearing." He met her eyes across the flames. "Your father was gathering evidence against him, working with me to build a case the territorial judge couldn't ignore." Abigail stared at him. "What kind of evidence?" "Proof that Dawson was running a protection racket, threatening smaller ranchers, manipulating water rights." Matthew took a sip of his coffee. "Your father kept records, dates, amounts, names of Dawson's men involved in various incidents." "Father was always writing in his ledgers," Abigail said, remembering her father's neat handwriting filling page after page. "But they would have burned with everything else." Matthew studied her face for a long moment. "Unless he hid them somewhere else. Samuel was too smart to keep something that valuable where Dawson's men could easily find it." Abigail thought hard, trying to remember if her father had mentioned anything about hiding important documents. "There was an old line shack about 2 miles west of here. Father used it during calving season sometimes." Hope flickered in Matthew's eyes. "First light tomorrow, we'll check it out. Those records could be the key to bringing Dawson to justice." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant call of a night creatures the only sounds. Despite her earlier bravado, exhaustion was overtaking Abigail. The long journey from Cheyenne, the shock of finding her home destroyed and her father dead, it was all catching up to her. "Get some sleep, Miss Sinclair," Matthew said gently. "I'll keep watch." Abigail wanted to argue, to insist she wasn't tired, but her eyelids were growing heavy. She wrapped herself in the blanket Matthew had given her and lay down on his bedroll, which he had insisted she use. "What will you do if we find the evidence?" she asked, fighting to keep her eyes open. Matthew stared into the fire, his profile strong against the darkness. "Take it to Judge Morrison in Cheyenne. He's one of the few honest judges in the territory. With solid evidence, we could get Dawson arrested and tried." "And if we don't find it?" she persisted. Matthew's eyes, when they met hers across the flames, were hard with determination. "Then I'll find another way. Your father deserved justice, and so do you." For the first time since discovering the destruction, Abigail felt a small spark of hope. She drifted into a fitful sleep, with the image of the marshal's resolute face in her mind. She dreamed of fire and hoofbeats, of her father's voice calling warnings she couldn't quite hear. When she woke with a start, the sky was still dark. But the first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern horizon. Matthew sat exactly where she had last seen him, his rifle across his knees, his eyes alert as he scanned the surrounding darkness. "You didn't sleep," she observed, sitting up and pulling the blanket around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. "I'll sleep when Dawson's behind bars," he said, reaching for the coffee pot he'd kept warm at the edge of the banked fire. He poured her a cup and handed it over. "Ready to check that line shack once there's light?" Abigail nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Marshal Yates, what happens after? Even if we find Father's evidence, even if Dawson is arrested, this is still my home, or what's left of it." Matthew considered her question carefully. "Rebuilding won't be easy," he acknowledged, "but this is good land, with water rights and established grazing. If you want to stay and rebuild, there are people in Willow Creek who would help. Your father had friends. And if Dawson has friends too, men who would continue his work even with him gone, then they'll have to go through me," Matthew said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to put himself between her and danger. The sky gradually lightened, revealing the full extent of the destruction that had been partially hidden by darkness the night before. In daylight, it seemed even more hopeless. The main house was completely gone, as was the bunkhouse where the ranch hands had slept. Only portions of the barn remained standing, and the corral fences were mostly ash. They were thorough, Matthew said grimly as they mounted their horses, his Appaloosa and a bay mare that had belonged to Abigail's father, found grazing nearby the previous evening. They rode in silence toward the line shack, Abigail leading the way through pastures she knew like the back of her hand. The 2-mile ride gave her time to think, to remember her father's patient lessons as he taught her about the land, the cattle, the business of ranching. Samuel Sinclair had raised his daughter to be independent and capable, never treating her as less because she was female. In her heart, she knew he would want her to fight for what was rightfully hers. The line shack came into view, a simple one-room structure built of logs and stone, with a small corral beside it. It appeared untouched, suggesting Dawson's men either didn't know about it or hadn't considered it important. Matthew dismounted first, drawing his pistol as he approached the shack cautiously. Abigail stayed close behind him, her father's derringer in hand, small but better than nothing. The door creaked open at Matthew's touch. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight, streaming through the single window. A narrow cot stood against one wall, a small table and chair against another, and a stone fireplace occupied the third, simple, functional, and seemingly undisturbed. Where would he hide something here? Matthew wondered aloud, his eyes scanning the Spartan interior. Abigail moved past him, memories guiding her. Father always said the best hiding place is one nobody would think to look. She went to the fireplace and knelt before it, running her hands along the stones. He built this himself, said every man should know how to lay a proper hearth. Her fingers found what she was searching for, a loose stone near the back of the fireplace. Wiggling it free, she reached into the cavity behind and pulled out an oilskin package. "This might be it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew joined her, kneeling beside her as she carefully unwrapped the oilskin to reveal a leather-bound ledger and a stack of papers. Flipping through the pages, Abigail recognized her father's meticulous handwriting dates, names, amounts, and detailed descriptions of threats and actions taken by Dawson and his men. "This is exactly what we need," Matthew said, his voice tinged with excitement and relief. "Your father documented everything: land grabs, threats, suspected arsons, cattle rustling, even payments to the county sheriff to look the other way. So, that's why Sheriff Briggs never did anything," Abigail said bitterly. "Father complained to him multiple times." Matthew nodded grimly. "Briggs is on Dawson's payroll, according to these notes. That's why your father was working with me instead." He carefully rewrapped the documents. "We need to get these to Judge Morrison in Cheyenne as soon as possible." A sudden noise outside froze them both. The unmistakable sound of approaching horses, moving fast and purposeful. Matthew was on his feet in an instant, pistol drawn. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "3 riders," he said tersely, "coming straight for us." Abigail felt her heart racing. "Dawson's men? Most likely. Someone must have seen us leave the ranch site." Matthew pressed the package of documents into her hands. "Hide these again, quickly." Abigail returned the package to its hiding place as Matthew positioned himself by the door. "Stay back," he ordered her, his voice leaving no room for argument. The riders pulled up outside, and a rough voice called out, "Marshal Yates, we know you're in there with the Sinclair girl." Matthew exchanged a glance with Abigail. "That's Rance Cooper," he said quietly, "Dawson's foreman." "Come on out, Marshal," Cooper called again. "We just want to talk." "Armed men don't usually ride up like this for a friendly conversation, Cooper," Matthew called back. "What do you want?" "Mr. Dawson's concerned about some missing property," Cooper answered. "Thought the Sinclair girl might have taken something that belongs to him." "The only thing stolen around here was my father's life," Abigail said loudly, moving toward the door, despite Matthew's warning glance. There was a harsh laugh from outside. "Your pa was a thief and a troublemaker, girl. He got what was coming to him." Abigail lunged toward the door, fury driving her, but Matthew caught her arm, holding her back. "That's what they want," he whispered urgently, "to provoke us into doing something foolish." The riders were spreading out around the small cabin, their intentions clear. They meant to flush out the occupants one way or another. "We're outnumbered," Matthew said quietly. but we have the advantage of shelter. If we can hold them off until dark, we might be able to slip away." "And if we can't?" Abigail asked, gripping her small derringer tightly. Matthew's eyes met hers, steady and determined. "Then we make our stand here. But I won't let them hurt you, Abigail. I swear it." It was the first time he had used her given name, and somehow it steadied her, made her feel less alone in this fight. "1 minute to come out peacefully," Cooper shouted. "Then we start shooting." "They're bluffing," Matthew said. "They want those documents. If they burn down the shack, they risk destroying what they're after." But as the seconds ticked by, Abigail wasn't so sure. The men outside were growing restless, their horses snorting and stamping. "Time's up, Marshal," Cooper called. "Have it your way." The first shot shattered the window, sending glass flying. Matthew pushed Abigail down, shielding her with his body as more bullets splintered the wooden door and walls. "Stay low," he ordered, moving to return fire through the broken window. The exchange of gunfire was deafening in the small space. Abigail crawled to the other side of the room, where a small rear window offered another vantage point. Peering carefully around the edge of the frame, she could see one of Cooper's men trying to circle behind the cabin. "Marshal, behind us!" she called, raising her derringer. The small pistol wasn't meant for distance shooting, but at that moment, it was the only defense they had on that side of the cabin. Abigail took careful aim, remembering her father's lessons, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make the man dive for cover. Matthew was engaged in a fierce exchange with Cooper and the third man at the front of the cabin. He was a skilled marksman, making each bullet count, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. "We need to find a way out," Abigail said, frantically searching for options. "There's no back door," Matthew replied, reloading his pistol, "and they have us surrounded." A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. New voices were shouting, more gunfire erupted, but not directed at the cabin. Matthew risked a glance out the window. "It's Ben Turner and some of the other ranchers," he said, relief evident in his voice. "They must have heard the shooting." The tide of the battle quickly turned. Cooper and his men were now the ones outnumbered, and after a brief but intense exchange, they retreated, galloping away with the ranchers in pursuit. Matthew cautiously opened the cabin door. Ben Turner, a stocky man with a silver-streaked beard, approached with his rifle still at the ready. "Marshal," he greeted Matthew with a nod. "Miss Sinclair, thought you might need some help when we heard gunfire in this direction." "Your timing couldn't have been better, Ben," Matthew said, holstering his pistol. "They were after some documents Samuel left behind evidence against Dawson." "Did you find them?" Turner asked eagerly. Abigail nodded, retrieving the package from its hiding place. "Everything my father documented about Dawson's crimes." Turner's face broke into a grim smile. "Then it's high time we paid a visit to Judge Morrison in Cheyenne." The small posse of ranchers escorted Matthew and Abigail back to the Turner ranch, where Clara Turner fussed over Abigail's minor cuts from the broken glass and insisted she rest before the journey to Cheyenne. "You've been through enough, child," Clara said firmly, setting a plate of food before her. "Eat something and lie down for a few hours. The men are keeping watch." Exhaustion finally caught up with Abigail, and she slept deeply for the first time since returning to find her home destroyed. When she woke, the afternoon was waning. She found Matthew and Ben Turner at the kitchen table, discussing plans. "We leave for Cheyenne at first light tomorrow," Matthew informed her. "Ben and 3 others will ride with us for protection." "Dawson won't give up easily," Turner added. "Those documents are his downfall, and he knows it." Abigail squared her shoulders. "Then we'd better make sure they reach Judge Morrison." That evening, as the Turner household settled for the night, Abigail found herself unable to sleep despite her earlier rest. She slipped outside onto the porch, where the cool night air helped clear her thoughts. The events of the past days swirled in her mind, the loss of her father, her home, and the dangerous path ahead. She didn't hear Matthew join her until he spoke quietly. "You should be resting." Startled, she turned to find him leaning against the porch railing, his expression soft in the moonlight. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Thinking about tomorrow? About everything." She sighed, looking out at the dark landscape. "Even if we get the evidence to the judge, even if Dawson is arrested, what then? The ranch is gone. Everything my father built is ashes." Matthew moved closer, his presence somehow reassuring, Buildings can be rebuilt, Abigail. The land is still there. Your father's legacy isn't in the structures, but in what he taught you, in the dream he shared with you. Tears welled in her eyes. But that dream is gone now. I don't know if I can rebuild alone. My dreams are gone, she wept, the grief finally breaking through her carefully maintained strength. The cowboy answered, moving to her side and gently taking her hand in his. Dream again, with me beside you. Abigail looked up, startled by his words and the emotion behind them. I've admired your father for years, Matthew continued softly. And these past 2 days, I've come to admire his daughter just as much. Your courage, your determination. He paused, searching for words. I know we've only just met, but I feel as though I've known you much longer, and I want to help you rebuild, if you'll let me. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because sometimes a person comes into your life, and suddenly you can't imagine that life without them, he answered simply. I'm not asking for promises, Abigail, just a chance to stand beside you, to help you fight this battle and rebuild what was lost. In the moonlight, his eyes held a warmth that reached past her grief, kindling something new and unexpected. For the first time since finding her home destroyed, Abigail felt the stirring of hope, not just for justice, but for a future she hadn't dared imagine. I would welcome your help, Matthew, she said softly, using his given name for the first time. And your company. His smile, rare and genuine, transformed his face. He gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. We should both get some rest. Tomorrow's ride to Cheyenne will be long and possibly dangerous. Abigail nodded, but before turning to go inside, she impulsively reached up and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, then quickly retreated into the house, leaving Matthew standing on the porch, his hand raised to the spot her lips had touched. Dawn broke clear and cool, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold as the small party prepared to depart for Cheyenne. Matthew secured the precious documents inside his vest, close to his body where they would be safest. Abigail, dressed in riding clothes borrowed from Clara Turner's daughter, checked the cinch on her saddle one last time. Ready? Matthew asked, bringing his Appaloosa alongside her mare. Abigail nodded, determination in her eyes. The moment of vulnerability they had shared the night before had strengthened rather than weakened her resolve. There would be time for softer emotions later now. They had a mission to complete. The journey to Cheyenne would take 2 days of hard riding, with one night spent camping along the trail. Ben Turner and 3 other ranchers accompanied them, all armed and vigilant. They knew Dawson's men would be searching for them, possibly lying in wait along the main trails. We'll take the high route through Morrison Pass, Turner announced as they set out. It's longer, but less traveled. Might give us an advantage if Dawson's boys are watching the main road. They rode at a steady pace, alert to any sign of pursuit or ambush. By midday, they had covered considerable ground, the rolling plains giving way to more rugged terrain as they approached the foothills that would lead them to Morrison Pass. During a brief stop to rest the horses, Abigail found herself standing beside Matthew at the edge of a small stream. The others were a short distance away, giving them a moment of privacy. You've been quiet today, she observed, watching him fill his canteen. Matthew capped the canteen before answering. Just focused on getting to Cheyenne safely. He hesitated, then added, and thinking about what happens after. After? After we deliver the evidence. After Dawson is arrested. His eyes met hers. After you decide whether to rebuild the ranch or start fresh elsewhere. I've been thinking about that too, Abigail admitted. Part of me wants to reclaim what was taken, to honor my father by continuing what he started. But another part, Matthew prompted when she didn't continue. Abigail looked away, watching the clear water of the stream flow over smooth stones. Another part wonders if there might be a different dream waiting, something I haven't imagined yet. Before Matthew could respond, Turner called out that it was time to move on. The moment passed, but the unspoken possibility remained between them as they continued their journey. The afternoon brought them into increasingly difficult terrain, with narrow trails winding through rocky outcroppings. The higher elevation meant cooler temperatures, and clouds gathered on the horizon, suggesting rain might be coming. There's a sheltered spot about an hour ahead, Turner informed them. Good place to make camp for the night. Has water and some coverage if the weather turns. They pressed on, the horses picking their way carefully along the trail. Abigail, raised on horseback, handled the difficult path with ease, earning approving glances from the men. Matthew rode beside her when the trail permitted, their shoulders occasionally brushing as the path narrowed. The campsite, when they reached it, was indeed well chosen, a natural hollow sheltered by large boulders, with a small spring providing fresh water. The men quickly set about establishing a secure perimeter, while Matthew helped Abigail unsaddle her horse. "You ride well," he commented, lifting the saddle from her mare's back. "Your father taught you?" Abigail nodded, smiling at the memory. "From the time I could walk. Mother died when I was born, so father raised me alone. He said I took to horses like a duck to water." "He must have been proud of you," Matthew said softly. "I hope so." She busied herself rubbing down her mare, fighting the fresh wave of grief that threatened to overwhelm her. "He wanted me to be able to run the ranch someday. Taught me everything he knew about cattle, land management, even business dealings." "Unusual for a father to prepare his daughter that way," Matthew observed. "Most men would have remarried, had sons." "Father never stopped loving my mother," Abigail explained. "Said he couldn't imagine replacing her. And as for sons," she smiled wistfully, "he always said I was worth any 10 boys he might have had." Matthew's expression softened. He was right about that. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, suddenly conscious of the others nearby. There was something growing between them, something neither was quite ready to name, but both increasingly aware of. As darkness fell, they gathered around a small, carefully shielded fire. Turner had posted guards at strategic points around the camp, taking no chances with their safety. The mood was subdued, everyone aware of both the importance of their mission and the dangers they faced. Abigail accepted a tin plate of beans and salt pork from Matthew, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the food. He seemed to understand, nodding slightly before settling beside her on a fallen log. They ate in companionable silence, listening to the murmured conversations of the other men and the occasional call of a night bird. "What made you become a marshal?" Abigail asked after a while. Curious about this man, who had so quickly become important to her, Matthew set aside his empty plate before answering. "Saw too much lawlessness during and after the war. Men taking what they wanted because they had the guns to do it. Figured the frontier needed men willing to stand for something different." "Is that why you were helping my father? Standing for something different?" He nodded slowly. "Samuel reminded me of my own father, stubborn, principled, unwilling to bend when he knew he was in the right. Men like Dawson count on others being too afraid to stand against them. Your father wasn't afraid." "Neither are you," Abigail observed. Matthew's smile was tinged with sadness. "I've just learned there are things worse than dying, living with yourself when you've turned away from what's right. For instance." His words resonated deeply with Abigail. Despite having known him only a few days, she felt as though she understood Matthew Yates in a fundamental way. Perhaps it was because they shared similar values, or perhaps it was something more, a connection that defied easy explanation. As the evening wore on, Turner organized the watch rotation for the night. Matthew volunteered for the first shift, moving to a position where he could observe the trail they had ascended. Abigail prepared her bedroll near the dying fire, but sleep eluded her. After an hour of restless turning, she rose and walked quietly to where Matthew kept his vigil. "You should be sleeping," he said without turning, somehow knowing it was her approaching. "I'm too restless," she admitted, settling beside him on a flat rock. "Too many thoughts?" The night was clear, stars brilliantly visible in the mountain air. A half-moon provided enough light to see the outlines of the landscape spread below them, rolling hills giving way to the distant plains. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Matthew said after a comfortable silence. "Even with all the hardship and danger, there's something about this country that gets in your blood." "My father used to say the same thing," Abigail replied. "He came west with nothing, built everything through hard work and determination. He loved the land more than anything." "Except you," Matthew said gently. Anyone could see that. Tears threatened again, but Abigail blinked them away. "I keep thinking about what you said last night, about dreaming again." Matthew turned to look at her, his expression open and unguarded in the moonlight. "What about it? I've been afraid to think beyond getting justice for my father," she confessed, afraid to hope for anything more. But tonight, looking at those stars, she gestured upward. "I can almost believe there might be new dreams waiting." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Matthew reached for her hand. When she didn't resist, he entwined his fingers with hers. "There are, Abigail. I promise you that." For a long moment, they sat in silence, hands joined, the vast starry sky above them. It was a small beginning, tentative and fragile, but in that moment, it felt like enough. "You should get some rest," Matthew finally said. "My watch is almost done, and we have another long day tomorrow." Abigail nodded, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. "Good night, Matthew." "Good night, Abigail," he replied softly. "Sleep well." She returned to her bedroll, and this time, sleep came more easily, her dreams untouched by fire and loss for the first time since her return. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, the air heavy with impending rain. They broke camp quickly, eager to reach Cheyenne before the weather worsened. The trail through Morrison Pass would be treacherous if wet, and they needed to make good time. As they rode, the clouds thickened, occasional rumbles of thunder warning of the storm to come. By mid-morning, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall, quickly becoming a steady downpour that reduced visibility and turned the trail to slick mud. "We need to keep moving," Turner shouted over the drumming rain. "Pass gets worse than this in a real storm." They pressed on, horses picking their way carefully along the narrowing trail. Abigail's mare was sure-footed despite the conditions, but the going was slow and dangerous. Matthew stayed close beside her, his Appaloosa equally steady on the treacherous path. They were nearing the highest point of the pass when disaster struck. A lightning bolt hit a tree on the slope above them, sending it crashing down across the trail just ahead. The horses reared in panic, and one of the ranchers was thrown, tumbling dangerously close to the edge of the precipice. "Harris!" Turner shouted, dismounting quickly to help the fallen man. Matthew was already moving, securing his horse and rushing to where the rancher lay dangerously close to the edge. Together with Turner, he pulled the injured man to safety. "Broken arm, maybe ribs too," Matthew assessed grimly. "He can't ride alone." "I'll double with him," offered one of the other ranchers. "But we need to get off this mountain before the trail washes out completely." Abigail had dismounted as well, holding the reins of the nervous horses as the men tended to their injured companion. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. "The fallen tree is blocking the trail," she called out, pointing to where the massive trunk lay across their path. "We'll have to go around," Turner decided, looking at the steep slope. "There's a game trail about 50 yards back that branches off. Might take us down to the main road, but it's our best option now." They backtracked carefully, finding the narrow trail Turner had mentioned. It was barely wide enough for a single horse, winding precariously down the mountainside. "I'll lead," Turner said. "Matthew, you bring up the rear. Make sure nobody gets left behind." One by one, they started down the treacherous path, the injured Harris riding double with another rancher. Abigail found herself in the middle of the group, her mare stepping cautiously on the slippery ground. The descent was nerve-wracking, each step potentially disastrous on the rain-slicked trail. Abigail kept her focus on the path ahead, trusting her mare's instincts and trying not to think about the steep drop to their right. They had made it perhaps halfway down when gunfire erupted from below. Bullets whined past them, splintering bark from trees and ricocheting off rocks. "Ambush!" Turner shouted, drawing his rifle. "Take cover!" But there was little cover to be found on the narrow trail. Matthew pushed forward to reach Abigail, pulling her from the saddle and behind a large boulder that offered minimal protection. "Dawson's men," he said grimly, checking his pistol. "They must have guessed we'd take the pass and were waiting for us to come down." More shots rang out, answered by Turner and the other ranchers. The horses, panicked by the gunfire, bolted down the trail, leaving them stranded but taking the attackers' attention with them. "How many do you see?" Abigail asked, trying to peer around the boulder. "At least 5, maybe more," Matthew replied, firing carefully at a movement below. "They have the advantage of position." The firefight continued, with neither side gaining the upper hand. The rain made accuracy difficult, which was perhaps the only thing keeping them alive, but they were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, and Matthew's ammunition wouldn't last forever. "We need a diversion," Abigail said suddenly. "Something to draw their fire while you and the others can get a better position." Matthew shook his head firmly. "Whatever you're thinking, forget it. I'm not letting you put yourself in danger." "We're all in danger," she retorted. "And we need those documents to reach Judge Morrison. That's what matters most." Before he could stop her, Abigail reached for a loose rock and hurled it down the slope to their left, away from the trail. The noise caught the attention of at least some of the ambushers, who fired in that direction. "Now!" she urged Matthew. "While they're distracted." Matthew hesitated only briefly before signaling to Turner and the others. Taking advantage of the momentary confusion, they began moving laterally across the slope, seeking better cover and firing positions. The strategy worked, allowing them to flank the ambushers and force them back. But as the gunfire intensified, the rain weakened ground beneath Abigail, and Matthew suddenly gave way. They tumbled down the steep slope in a cascade of mud and rocks, unable to stop their descent. Abigail felt Matthew's arms wrap protectively around her as they fell, his body taking the brunt of the impact as they crashed through underbrush and over rocks. They finally came to rest in a shallow ravine, the sound of gunfire now distant above them. "Abigail!" Matthew groaned, his voice tight with pain. "Are you hurt?" She disentangled herself from his embrace, quickly checking for injuries. She was scraped and bruised, her clothes torn and mud-soaked, but nothing seemed broken. "I'm all right," she assured him, "but you're bleeding." A gash on his forehead was streaming blood, and he winced as he tried to sit up. "Ribs," he managed through clenched teeth. "Think I might have cracked one." Abigail tore a strip from her already ruined petticoat and used it to bind his wound. "Can you walk? We need to find shelter." Matthew nodded grimly, allowing her to help him to his feet. The ravine they had landed in continued downward, potentially leading away from the ambushers above. With no better option, they began making their way along it, Matthew leaning heavily on Abigail for support. The rain continued unabated, turning the ravine into a small stream that made walking treacherous. They moved as quickly as Matthew's injuries would allow, both aware that Dawson's men would likely be searching for them once they realized they were no longer on the trail above. "The documents," Abigail suddenly remembered. "Do you still have them?" Matthew patted his vest weakly. "Safe. Wrapped them in oilskin before we left camp." Relief flooded through her. As long as they had the evidence, there was still hope for justice. Now they just needed to survive long enough to deliver it. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, they spotted a small abandoned miner's shack tucked into the hillside ahead. It was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it offered shelter from the relentless rain and a place to tend Matthew's injuries properly. "Thank God," Abigail breathed, helping Matthew toward the decrepit structure. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, but the roof appeared mostly intact. Inside, dust and cobwebs covered the sparse furnishings. A crude table, a single chair, and what had once been a bed frame, but was now just rotting wood. Abigail helped Matthew to sit with his back against the wall, then quickly checked the shack for anything useful. In a corner, she found an old blanket, moth-eaten but dry, and a tin cup that could be used to collect rainwater. "We should be safe here for a while," she said, returning to Matthew's side. "Let me check that cut properly." The gash on his forehead was deep, but had begun to clot. More concerning was his labored breathing and the way he winced with each movement. Abigail carefully opened his shirt to examine his rib cage, trying to ignore the impropriety of the situation given the circumstances. "Definitely bruised, maybe cracked," she assessed, noting the darkening bruise spreading across his side. "We need to bind them to help with the pain." Using more strips torn from her petticoat, Abigail created a makeshift binding for Matthew's ribs, working as gently as possible. Despite her care, he couldn't suppress an occasional grimace of pain. "You seem to know what you're doing," he observed, watching her efficient movements. "Father believed everyone on a ranch should know basic doctoring," she explained. "Too far from town to wait for a doctor every time someone gets hurt." Once his ribs were bound and his head wound cleaned as best she could manage, Abigail sat back on her heels. That's all I can do for now? How do you feel? Like I fell down a mountain, Matthew replied with a weak attempt at humor. But I'll live, thanks to you. Abigail shook her head. You were protecting me in that fall. I should be thanking you. Outside, the rain continued to pour, drumming on the roof and occasionally finding its way through gaps in the shingles. The light was fading, suggesting evening was approaching, though it was hard to tell through the storm clouds. We should rest while we can, Matthew suggested. At first light, we need to find a way to Cheyenne. Turner and the others will either think we're dead or head on to deliver the news of the ambush. But you have the documents, Abigail pointed out. Matthew nodded. Which means we still have to complete the mission, but not tonight. Tonight we recover our strength. Abigail spread the old blanket on the floor beside him, then hesitated. The temperature was dropping with nightfall, and both of them were soaked to the skin. We need to share body heat, Matthew said, reading her thoughts. It's the only way to prevent chilling in these wet clothes. Despite the circumstances, Abigail felt a blush rising to her cheeks. But practicality won out over modesty, and she carefully settled beside him, mindful of his injuries. Matthew wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close against his side. Better? He asked softly. Abigail nodded, gradually relaxing against him. Despite their dire situation, stranded, injured, hunted, there was something undeniably comforting about Matthew's presence. His steady heartbeat under her ear reminded her that they were alive, and as long as they lived, they had a chance. Do you think Turner and the others made it? She asked after a while. Ben Turner is one of the toughest men I know, Matthew replied. If anyone could get through that ambush, it's him. But whether they continue to Cheyenne or come looking for us is another question. If they're smart, they'll go to Cheyenne, Abigail said firmly. Getting help is more important than finding us. Matthew's arm tightened slightly around her. You're remarkably practical, Abigail Sinclair. I'm a rancher's daughter, she said simply. Practicality keeps you alive out here. They fell silent, listening to the rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Despite her exhaustion, Abigail found herself acutely aware of Matthew's closeness, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his body, the faint scent of leather and gunpowder that clung to him even now. What will you do? She asked suddenly. After Dawson is brought to justice, I mean. Matthew was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I've been marshal in Willow Creek for 5 years. It's good work, important work. But lately, I've been thinking about putting down roots somewhere, building something that lasts. A ranch of your own? Abigail suggested. Perhaps. There was something in his tone that suggested he was considering more than just ranching. What about you? Will you rebuild your father's ranch? Abigail sighed, the weight of that decision heavy on her heart. I don't know. Part of me wants to honor his memory, but it would be starting from nothing and alone. Not alone, Matthew said quietly. I meant what I said, Abigail, about dreaming again, with me beside you. She lifted her head to look at him, trying to read his expression in the gathering darkness of the shack. Matthew, we barely know each other. His eyes, steady and sincere, met hers. Sometimes a person knows in days what others take years to discover. I know you're brave and principled. I know you're capable and kind. I know that in the short time we've known each other, you've come to matter to me in ways I never expected. Abigail's heart quickened at his words. There was a certainty in his voice that both frightened and thrilled her. In the midst of loss and danger, something new was taking root, something unexpected but increasingly precious. I feel it too, she admitted softly. This connection between us. But with everything that's happening, I can barely think beyond surviving each day. I'm not asking for promises now, Matthew assured her. Just telling you that whatever you decide, whatever path you choose, I want to walk it with you, if you'll have me. In the darkness of that abandoned miner's shack, with rain pounding on the roof and danger lurking outside, Abigail made a choice. She reached up and touched Matthew's face gently, mindful of his injuries, then leaned in and pressed her lips to his in a soft, tentative kiss. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sealed something between them, an unspoken agreement, a shared possibility. When she pulled away, Matthew's eyes were wide with surprise and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "We should try to sleep," she whispered, settling back against his side. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Matthew's arm encircled her once more, holding her close as if she were something precious he feared losing. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night, Matthew," she responded, closing her eyes and allowing exhaustion to finally claim her. They slept fitfully, discomfort and anxiety making deep rest impossible. Sometime in the night, the rain finally stopped and an eerie silence descended on the mountainside. Abigail woke at first light, stiff and sore, but warmer than she expected. Matthew was already awake, watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "Morning," he said softly. "How do you feel?" "Like I fell down a mountain," she replied, echoing his words from the previous evening. It earned her a small smile, which she counted as a victory given their circumstances. Matthew's injuries looked worse in the daylight. The bruising on his side had darkened alarmingly, and the cut on his forehead was swollen, but his eyes were clear, and when he carefully tested his mobility, he seemed stronger than the night before. "We need to get moving," he said, grimacing as he pushed himself to his feet. "Dawson's men will be searching for us, and we need to reach Cheyenne." "Which way?" Abigail asked, joining him at the doorway of the shack. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fresh, washed morning. From their elevated position, they could see for miles rolling foothills giving way to plains in the distance. Matthew studied the landscape, getting his bearings. "Cheyenne is southeast from here. If we follow this ravine down to the flats, then head east. We should reach the main road eventually." It was a plan with many uncertainties, but it was the best they had. They set out carefully, Matthew moving slower than he would have liked due to his injuries, but with determined purpose. Abigail stayed close beside him, ready to offer support when needed, though he rarely asked for it. The ravine eventually widened into a small valley, where a stream gurgled over rocks on its way to join larger waters. They followed it downstream, finding the going easier on the valley floor. Wild berries growing along the banks provided a meager breakfast, and clear water slaked their thirst. "How far to Cheyenne, do you think?" Abigail asked as the morning wore on. "On horseback, from where we were ambushed, maybe 6 or 7 hours," Matthew estimated. "On foot with these injuries." He shook his head. 2 days, possibly 3. The enormity of their task settled heavily on Abigail's shoulders. 2 or 3 days of walking, evading Dawson's men, with little food, and Matthew injured. But what choice did they have? They had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when Matthew suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. Abigail froze, listening intently. At first, she heard nothing but the gentle babble of the stream and distant bird song, then the unmistakable sound of horses approaching. "Quick!" Matthew whispered, pulling her toward a dense thicket of brush. They crouched low, Matthew's hand on his pistol, which had somehow survived their fall. The riders came into view around a bend in the valley, 3 men, moving at a slow walk, clearly searching for something, or someone. "Cooper," Matthew breathed, recognizing Dawson's foreman, "and 2 others from the ambush." Abigail's heart raced as the men drew closer. There was nowhere to run without being seen, and Matthew was in no condition for another firefight. Their only hope was to remain hidden and pray the men moved on. But luck wasn't with them. One of the riders pulled up sharply, pointing to the ground. "Tracks here, Cooper! Fresh ones!" Cooper dismounted, examining the soft earth where Abigail and Matthew had walked not 10 minutes earlier. 2 people, one moving with a limp, has to be them. The third man scanned the surrounding area, his gaze passing over their hiding place. "Can't have gone far. Spread out and search." Abigail felt Matthew tense beside her, his hand tightening on his pistol. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and Matthew was injured. The odds were decidedly not in their favor. Just as Cooper was remounting, a shot rang out from further down the valley, then another. The 3 men whirled toward the sound, weapons drawn. "What the hell?" Cooper growled. "Mason, check it out." One of the men spurred his horse toward the source of the gunfire. More shots followed, then shouting. Cooper and the remaining man moved to follow, weapons ready. "It's a trap!" they heard Mason yell back. "Turner and his men!" Abigail and Matthew exchanged hopeful glances. Ben Turner had found them after all, or at least created a diversion that might save them. As Cooper and his companions galloped toward the commotion, Matthew pulled Abigail to her feet. "This is our chance," he said urgently. "We need to move in the opposite direction." They hurried away from the sounds of conflict, pushing through the underbrush and crossing the stream. Matthew was moving better than expected, adrenaline temporarily masking his pain. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the unmistakable sound of a horse nickering stopped them in their tracks. Cautiously approaching, they found a small clearing where a familiar Appaloosa was tethered to a tree, along with Abigail's bay mare. "Our horses!" Abigail exclaimed in disbelief. But how? Turner must have found them after the ambush, Matthew realized, moving quickly to untie the animals. He knew we'd be on foot and left them here as a contingency while he dealt with Cooper's men. It was a stroke of fortune they desperately needed. The saddlebags still contained some provisions, and more importantly, the horses would cut their journey time dramatically. Matthew checked to ensure the precious documents were still secure inside his vest, then helped Abigail mount before painfully pulling himself into his own saddle. "We ride for Cheyenne," he said, determination in his voice. "Turner and the others are buying us time, and we can't waste it." They set off at a canter, following the valley until it opened onto the plains, then turning southeast toward Cheyenne. The going was easier on horseback, but Matthew's injuries made riding painful, and Abigail watched him with concern as the day wore on. By mid-afternoon, they reached the main road to Cheyenne. It was risky to travel such an open route, but speed was now essential. The documents had to reach Judge Morrison before Dawson learned of their survival and sent more men. The hours passed in a blur of dust and determination. Matthew grew increasingly pale, the jostling of the horse aggravating his injuries, but he refused to stop for more than brief rests. Abigail rode beside him, watching for signs that he might fall from the saddle, ready to catch him if he did. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the distant outlines of Cheyenne appeared ahead. The territorial capital was the largest settlement Abigail had ever seen, with proper streets, substantial buildings, and the buzz of a growing frontier hub. "Judge Morrison's office is near the courthouse," Matthew said, his voice strained with fatigue and pain. "We need to go there directly." They rode into town as dusk was falling, drawing curious looks from townspeople unused to seeing a battered lawman and a mud-stained young woman riding hell bent down their streets. Matthew led them to a substantial brick building where a sign proclaimed "Territorial Courts." Dismounting was agony for him, and Abigail quickly slid from her own horse to help him. Together, they made their way inside, asking the startled clerk for Judge Morrison. "The judge is in his chambers, but he doesn't receive visitors after hours," the clerk began pompously. Matthew pulled aside his coat to reveal his marshal's badge. "This is official territorial business. Tell him Marshal Matthew Yates has evidence in the Victor Dawson case." The name Dawson clearly carried weight, for the clerk's demeanor changed instantly. "Wait here," he instructed, hurrying down a hallway. Moments later, a tall, distinguished man with iron gray hair and penetrating eyes appeared. "Marshal Yates," he greeted Matthew, taking in his battered appearance with concern. "And this must be Samuel Sinclair's daughter. I've been expecting you. Turner's men arrived an hour ago with news of the ambush. We feared you might be dead." "Not for lack of trying on Dawson's part, Your Honor," Matthew replied grimly, retrieving the oilskin package from inside his vest. "Samuel Sinclair's evidence, as complete as we could make it." Judge Morrison accepted the package reverently, understanding its significance and the cost of delivering it. "Come into my chambers," he invited. "You both look like you could use a seat and something strong to drink." In the privacy of the judge's well-appointed office, Matthew and Abigail recounted the events of the past days, while Morrison examined the documents. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read Samuel Sinclair's meticulous notes. "This is more than enough to issue warrants for Dawson and his men," he finally declared, looking up from the papers. Samuel built a case that even the most corrupt judge couldn't ignore: detailed accounts, dates, witnesses, financial records showing bribes. He shook his head in admiration. "Your father was a thorough man, Miss Sinclair." "Yes, he was," Abigail agreed softly, feeling a bittersweet pride. Morrison pulled a cord to summon his clerk. "I'll have the warrants drawn up immediately and dispatched to the federal marshals. By this time tomorrow, Dawson and his accomplices will be in custody." "What about Sheriff Briggs?" Matthew asked. "The evidence shows he's been taking Dawson's money for years." "Him too," Morrison assured them. "No one is above the law, especially not those sworn to uphold it." He studied them both for a moment. "You've done a remarkable service to this territory, at great personal risk. Now you both need medical attention and rest. My home is at your disposal until this matter is concluded." The offer was gratefully accepted. Judge Morrison's house was a comfortable two-story residence not far from the courthouse, where his housekeeper fussed over their injuries and prepared hot baths and clean clothing. A doctor was summoned to properly tend Matthew's ribs and head wound, confirming 2 cracked ribs, but no more serious injuries. Later that evening, freshly bathed and dressed in borrowed clothes, Abigail found herself sitting with Matthew on the judge's veranda. The night air was cool but pleasant, stars emerging in the darkening sky above Cheyenne. "It's strange," she mused, sipping the tea the housekeeper had insisted they drink. "A week ago, I was visiting my aunt in Cheyenne with no idea of what awaited me at home. Now everything is different." Matthew nodded, his profile thoughtful in the lamplight spilling from the house. "Life can change in an instant out here, sometimes for the worse. And sometimes for the better," Abigail finished, meeting his gaze when he turned to look at her. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. The danger was not yet past. Dawson was still free, at least for the moment, but for the first time, Abigail could see beyond the immediate crisis to what might come after. "Judge Morrison says the trials will take weeks, possibly months," she said eventually. "Dawson has connections, money for lawyers. But the evidence is solid," Matthew reminded her, "and Morrison is known for running a fair but strict courtroom. Dawson won't escape justice this time." "And after?" Abigail asked the question that had been on her mind since their conversation in the abandoned shack. "What happens after justice is served?" Matthew set aside his cup and turned to fully face her, his expression serious yet gentle. "That depends on you, Abigail. On what you want." "What I want," she repeated softly, considering the question. A week ago, the answer would have been simple: to continue her father's legacy, to run the Double S Ranch as he had taught her. But now, "I want to rebuild," she said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not just structures, but a life. I want to honor my father by continuing what he started, but also by finding my own path. And," she hesitated, then met Matthew's eyes directly, "I don't want to do it alone." Matthew reached for her hand, enfolding it in his. "You won't have to. If you'll have me, I'll be there to help rebuild the ranch, to stand beside you through whatever comes. I meant what I said on that mountain, Abigail. Dream again, with me beside you." In that moment, on a quiet veranda in Cheyenne, with justice in motion and the future unwritten, Abigail felt something she had thought lost forever in the ashes of her father's ranch hope. Not just for justice, but for happiness, for love, for a life richer than the one she had imagined. She leaned forward and kissed him, this time without hesitation or fear, a promise sealed under the vast Wyoming sky. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. As Judge Morrison had predicted, the federal marshals arrested Victor Dawson and his men within a day of receiving the warrants. Sheriff Briggs was taken into custody as well, his corruption exposed for all to see. The arrests sent shockwaves through the territory, as Dawson had seemed untouchable for so long. Abigail was required to stay in Cheyenne for the preliminary hearings, giving testimony about her father's murder and the destruction of their ranch. Matthew remained by her side, his steady presence a comfort through the difficult proceedings. As the territorial marshal for Willow Creek, his testimony was also crucial to the case against Dawson. Judge Morrison, true to his reputation, ran an efficient and fair courtroom. Despite Dawson's expensive lawyers and attempts to discredit the witnesses, the evidence Samuel Sinclair had gathered was irrefutable. When the judge bound Dawson over for trial and denied bail, citing the risk of flight and intimidation of witnesses, Abigail felt the first real sense of closure since her father's death. But justice, while necessary, couldn't bring back what was lost. As the legal proceedings continued, Abigail's thoughts turned increasingly to the future. She and Matthew spent their evenings talking, planning, dreaming of what might be. "The foundation of the house is still sound," Matthew said one evening as they studied the rough sketch he had made of the Double S Ranch. "And the well wasn't damaged. We could start rebuilding there, make it better than before." "We," Abigail repeated, the word warming her heart. Over the past weeks, what had begun as a connection born of crisis had deepened into something neither of them had expected to find. Matthew's quiet strength, his integrity, his tenderness toward her, these qualities had captured her heart completely. "Yes, we," Matthew confirmed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "If that's still what you want." "It is," she said without hesitation. "More than anything." 2 months after bringing Dawson to justice, with the trial dates set and their testimony complete for the time being, they were finally free to return to Willow Creek. The journey back was vastly different from their desperate flight to Cheyenne, leisurely, hopeful, filled with plans for the future. Ben Turner and the other ranchers welcomed them back with a celebration at the Turner Ranch. The community had rallied around Abigail in her absence, gathering materials for rebuilding, offering cattle to help restart her herd, and promising labor when construction began. "Your father was well loved," Clara Turner told her, as they watched the men discussing building plans. "And so are you, child. No one stands alone in these parts." The rebuilding of the Double S Ranch began the following day. Matthew had resigned his position as marshal, deciding that his future lay with Abigail and the land they would shape together. The foundation was laid for a new house, larger than the original, but still modest by some standards. The barn rose first, practical necessity dictating the order of construction. Through the summer months, they worked side by side, Abigail proving herself every bit as capable as Matthew had known she would be. She negotiated cattle purchases, managed the books, and worked alongside the men raising the framework of their new home. In the evenings, they would sit on the partially built porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I never thought I could be happy again," Abigail confessed one such evening, her head resting on Matthew's shoulder. "When I saw what was left of Father's ranch that day, I felt as though all my dreams had burned with it." Matthew pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Some dreams end so new ones can begin," he said softly. "Your father would be proud of what you're building here." "What we're building," she corrected him, turning to meet his gaze. The look that passed between them held all the words they didn't need to say, the understanding that had grown between them, the love that had blossomed from the ashes of tragedy, the future they were creating together. As summer gave way to autumn, word came from Cheyenne that Victor Dawson had been convicted on all charges, along with his foreman Cooper and several others. Justice had been served, though no punishment could truly compensate for the loss of Samuel Sinclair. Still, there was peace in knowing that Dawson would never again harm another family or steal another ranch. With that chapter finally closed, Matthew and Abigail turned fully toward their future. On a crisp October day, with the mountains dusted with the first snow of the season, they stood before the minister in Willow Creek's small church and exchanged vows that formalized what their hearts had known for months. Clara Turner wept openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. Ben Turner merely nodded approvingly, though those who knew him well could see the moisture in his eyes. The church was filled with ranchers and townspeople who had helped rebuild the Double S, all witnesses to a love that had emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. "Mrs. Yates," Matthew said that evening as they stood on the porch of their newly completed home. The name sounded right somehow, a perfect blending of her past and their future. "Mr. Yates," Abigail replied, her smile radiant in the golden light of sunset. Matthew pulled her into his arms, still marveling that this remarkable woman had chosen to share her life with him. "Happy?" he asked, though he could see the answer in her eyes. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "And we're only just beginning." As twilight settled over the Double S Ranch, painting the new buildings in shades of purple and gold, Abigail thought of her father. She hoped he could see what had risen from the ashes of his dream, not just buildings and cattle, but love, hope, and a future bright with promise. The ranch would continue, though perhaps not exactly as Samuel Sinclair had envisioned it. It would be something new, something built by both Abigail and Matthew, honoring the past while embracing the future. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Abigail smiled, leaning into his embrace as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I'm thinking about dreams, the ones that end, and the new ones that begin when we least expect them." Matthew tightened his arms around her, his voice soft against her hair. "Dream as big as you like, Abigail Yates. I'll be right beside you for every one of them." And in the years that followed, they did exactly that. The Double S flourished under their joint stewardship, becoming one of the most respected ranches in the territory. Their family grew with the arrival of children, first a son they named Samuel after Abigail's father, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's spirit and their father's steady determination. Life on the frontier was never easy. There were harsh winters, drought summers, challenges that tested their resolve and their partnership. But through it all, they faced each obstacle together, drawing strength from the love that had sparked in the most unlikely circumstances and grown into something neither could have imagined that first day among the ashes of the Sinclair ranch. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the work of the day was done, they would often sit on the porch of the home they had built together, watching the stars emerge above the land that had shaped them both. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Abigail would sometimes ask. "When I told you my dreams were gone?" And Matthew would always smile, taking her hand in his as he had done countless times over the years, his eyes still holding the same promise they had that night on a Wyoming mountainside. "Every day," he would answer, "because that was the night I found mine."